Hello, I'm Aaron Wren, Senior Fellow at the Manhattan Institute. Welcome to the 2017 James Q. Wilson Lecture featuring Ed Glazer. Now, Ed is someone who really needs no introduction, but lucky for me, I get to give one for him anyway. Ed Glazer is a Senior Fellow at the Manhattan Institute and a contributing editor at City Journal. He is the Fred and Eleanor Glint Professor of Economics at Harvard University, where he's taught since 1992. He's authored numerous influential economics papers and has also written for the public at large, notably his 2010 best-selling book, The Triumph of the City. Ed is a force of nature. How many of you were here for the last year's James Q. Wilson lecture on the future of work? I mean, it was a tour de force, as was the year before that on infrastructure and so on. So I am sure that we are in for something special tonight. Ed is going to be talking about how to revive America's heartland. The center of the country, particularly the rural and smaller urban areas, have really struggled in the 21st century. They've got problems ranging from economic stagnation to long-term joblessness to family breakdown to opioids. A lot of these problems came to the fore last year with the election of Donald Trump as president. He managed to flip states like Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin to red by capturing the votes in places like this. That caused a lot of folks in New York and on the coast to really start paying attention. J.D. Vance's book, Hillbilly Elegy, became a huge national bestseller. I have a personal connection to these places, having grown up in rural southern Indiana, 4 miles outside of a town of 29 people. My father, I love cities like only someone from a town of 29 people can. I've seen firsthand my father, a quarry superintendent, struggle to hire workers who would simply have a high school diploma, a driver's license, could pass a drug test, and show up to work every day. So this is a serious problem. But it's not just about bringing back the jobs. It's a much more complex problem. So as someone who's invested in these communities, personally, I'm very eager to hear what Ed has to say on the topic. So without further delay, ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Ed Glazer.
Thank you, Aaron, and thank you all for giving me half an hour, 45 minutes of your incredibly valuable time. I am so honored to be here, both as part of the Manhattan Institute family and as the James Q. Wilson lecturer this year. I am, of course, a disciple of Professor Wilson, and it's wonderful to be giving this talk bearing his name. I want to start where my last Wilson lecture ended, which is focusing on the awful rise of prime-age male joblessness in this country. So we went from a period 50 years ago in which 1 in 20 prime-age males were jobless to a point today where more than 3 in 5 are jobless, right? More than 15% are jobless, right? A dramatic change in the nature of America, but one that is very much not uniform throughout the country. This is a map of the employment rate of prime-age males across America. And you can see the Heartland is badly afflicted with this curse. This is not something that is the same in Massachusetts as in West Virginia. This is not something that is the same in Kentucky as in California. And for those of us who like to wrap ourselves up in our coastal cocoons, right, the election of the last year reminds us that when America is in pain, it impacts us all. And it is absolutely critical that even an institute named after this blessed island, right, pay some attention to the spaces between the coasts. And that's very much what my theme is for today. One thing that I'm going to highlight for the next 5 or 6 slides is when you think about the Heartland is not uniform. There are really 2 heartlands. And you can see there, the Heartland to the east is the epicenter of the disaster. The Heartland to the west has great swaths of land. They're actually doing pretty well. Let me show you the same graph for drug poisoning fatality. So this is one map of the opioid epidemic, right? Appalachia, it's in deep red. Huge parts of the Great Plains, it's white, right? It's much better off than Massachusetts is along this. Of course, Nevada, Utah, New Mexico, also disasters in this. This is disability. This comes from the University of Montana. The dark blues are the places where shares of the adult male population that are on disability are over 25%. Okay? This is their data, but they're extraordinary numbers. And of course, they correlate quite well with the opioid deaths. Okay? The strongest predictor we have of opioid deaths is the number of people who are on disability in the county in 1990. This comes from something that was just released today or yesterday. There was an article in the Wall Street Journal on it. It comes from the Economic Innovation Group Distressed Communities, this averages together a whole bunch of data. And again, it shows the same basic pattern, where there's this area in the center that is the absolute epicenter of American economic tragedy. So what I'm going to show you now is I'm going to split up America into three groups. We're going to take the coasts that we all know about, they're the states that abut the oceans. And then we're going to split the heartland into east and west. And this is the way that I'm splitting the states. Now, it might seem a little bit unusual, this split, but for those of you who've forgotten your history, I actually am not doing a split based on space. I'm doing a split based on time. These are the states of the Union in 1840. The red ones are the 1840 ones. The other ones are ones that came afterwards. So this split is dividing in 1850. And I want you to think very much of a newer heartland versus an older heartland. Right? And indeed, the problems are most centered in the older heartland. Okay, now, let's look at these three groups. This is prime-age male joblessness over the last 40 years. Okay? The green line, which will be throughout, is the western heartland. This actually has the lowest level of joblessness. Right? It's not dysfunctional. It's doing better than the other two regions are. The blue line starts out at about the same place, which is the coastal states, as the eastern heartland, and then divides up. So now the eastern heartland is, of course, the worst performing of these three regions. This is GDP growth. Again, starting at in the late 1970s, the coastal states in the western heartland have, by and large, kept pace with one another. Right? GDP growth is growing about as quickly in the western heartland as it is in the coast. The eastern heartland is a terrible laggard. And again, this emphasizes that you don't actually have to be Silicon Valley to grow. That in fact, there are parts of America that are doing extremely well, despite the fact that they are not on the coast, that they are not New York. And there's a lesson for the eastern heartland from the western heartland. This is manufacturing GDP growth. Here, the western heartland looks unique. It's the one of those lines that has grown. Right? Both the eastern heartland and the coastal states are relatively stagnant. The coast has done slightly better than this eastern heartland, but the western heartland has actually done most effectively. Now, GDP per worker is the area where the western heartland looks most like the eastern heartland, right, and where the coasts look best. We all know that incomes on the coast are much higher. But don't forget, housing prices are also much higher on the coast. And in fact, these western heartland residents are actually doing reasonably well. Finally, working population growth. Right? Again, a huge divergence. The western heartland is growing like crazy in terms of population. The coastal states are in the middle. The eastern heartland is the sluggard. Right? It's moving most slowly in terms of population growth. And when you think about overall GDP growth, that's combining faster growth in GDP per capita in the coastal states and faster growth in the per capita, in the number of people in the western heartland. And that's how these two things keep pace with one another. And finally, many of you may have seen the work of Angus Deaton and Ann Case about the disturbing reversal in mortality gains, right, in health gains for prime-age males. This splits up mortality among these three groups. You see that both in the western heartland and the coastal states, mortality looks okay. It's the eastern heartland that sees that growth in death rate, sees the growth in the mortality rate. Again, that's the epicenter of death for prime-age males and that growth in America. Now, I have a very simple model of economic growth. It's a two-factor model. And it says that the growth of a region, the growth of a country, depends on two things. Having rules that are pro-entrepreneurship, that are pro-business, that support the growth of industry, that support new entrepreneurs who want to get started and don't stand in their way, and education and human capital. These two things are related, as I'll talk about in a second, but it's basically about schools and rules. And when we think about, our European competitors, the social democracies of Northern Europe are not poor places. Their rules may not be particularly friendly towards businesses relative to, say, Texas, but they make up for it with schools. Whereas there are less educated parts of Europe which also have bad rules, which are economic disaster areas. This is education. As you can see, the Eastern Heartland tends to be the lowest area in terms of college educated. These are the trends, though. So the coastal states show the fastest growth in education. The green lines show the Western Heartland, which starts off quite high and actually has weak growth. And I raise the question here whether or not this poses a challenge for the future of the Western Heartland. the fact that its education is not growing in a way that matches the coastal states, and the Eastern Heartland, which starts with a significant deficit and then comes back. Now, there are lots of different ways of looking at the rules part, looking at the business environment, right? I choose a particular one, which is corruption. Measuring corruption at the state level is actually hard because a really corrupt state never charges its own officials, right? You're not going to find some Louisiana DA going after a Louisiana politician. So typically what we do is we use federal prosecution of corruption cases at the local level, and that's the usual index. My own work of this shows, for example, the correlation between corruption and education, that places that are better educated typically have less corruption. But this is the map of that across space, and this comes from Liu and Mike Cassell's work. Again, you see this Eastern Heartland as being a place where corruption is particularly endemic. It's hard to think about ever getting the rules right when your state senate is constantly being bought. It's hard to imagine that you could possibly get to a situation in which you could rethink the rules in a way that enlarged the pot for everyone if your situation is completely corrupt. Okay, now, what went wrong with Eastern Heartland, with this rules and schools framework? Schools. Why didn't the Eastern Heartland invest in schools? Two reasons. First of all, early industry. Early industry meant that kids could get jobs in factories, and they could look forward to having a union job on a GM factory floor when they grew up with absolutely no need for formal education. So throughout America, the places that industrialized early had the least interest in high schools, had the least interest in improving educational quality. And where was the birth of the American high school movement? Iowa, right? In the farm areas where they knew that their kids might have to do something other than farming, and so they invested in them. They also knew that those kids couldn't work on the farm during long seasons, and so schools were a good way to keep them out of trouble. In the South, you also have limits of education, and you saw that in the graph as well, that the former slave states were typically a disaster for investing in education as well. And states like Louisiana and Mississippi are still dealing with that legacy. Now, rules and schools are two factors, but they're not unrelated. I think no one is surprised that I'm much more of a Hamiltonian than I am of a Jeffersonian. After all, this is MI. But there are some things that Thomas Jefferson really got right. So Jefferson wrote that if a nation expects to be ignorant and free in a state of civilization, it expects what never was and never will be. That education is not just about empowering people economically, it's about empowering them politically as well. And we think about every important political reform movement that has come forth in New York over the past 200 years. It has been educated New Yorkers who have taken the lead. Over and over again. Think about the committee that brought down Boss Tweed, right? The presence of skills in this city is what gives it the impetus for political change. Now, that's one part of the story of corruption, of bad rules in the South. The second reason is in the solid South, you had limitations on political competition. Think about the role that political competition played in our own city, right, in New York. Think about the role that the Lexow Committee, which famously 110 years ago exposed the corruption of the Tammany Hall-controlled police force. That wonderful story of Clubber Williams, right, the famously corrupt New York City cop who commuted from his Cobb estate to his district in New York, which he famously called the Tenderloin, by yacht, right, who had to explain to the Lexow Committee interviewer that he had made a fortune investing in, get this, Tokyo real estate, okay? Now, this was not actually actionable in the late 19th century, but it sure as heck looked bad for Tammany. And the Republicans upstate managed to make that happen because they were fighting with Tammany Hall. In a one-party South, that didn't happen. In some cases, and this is the usual story of why Illinois is such a disaster, big city corruption seeps its way throughout the state, right? And that's a typical story that's told for Illinois. But I want to put a larger picture on this. I want to paint a dynamic picture that's really following from the path-breaking ideas of Manker Olson 35 years ago. So Olson told a story of rise and decline of nations where a region sees its economy grow and sees interest groups coalesce. They coalesce to protect what they currently have. They coalesce to keep out outsiders. They coalesce to prevent competition. Now, New York is old, right? And this exists even here in New York, believe it or not. There are, in fact, interest groups that don't like change, that want to prevent Uber drivers or other forms of competition from coming in. But there is a balance in New York because there are constantly lobbies on the other side. In smaller cities and less educated cities, that balance is less clear. And this is one way of viewing what's going on in the older cities of the US. Now, I know I've told this story before, but I just want to sort of reiterate it. So one of my favorite pet entrepreneurship causes is freeing the food truck, right? So I love deregulating food trucks. I think they're a great form of entrepreneurship for less skilled Americans to get started. Now, there's this famous cause célèbre of this woman who wanted to start her food truck in Detroit, the Pink Flamingo, about 10 years ago. And Detroit, of course, made her go through 18 months without giving her a permit. Now, I was on an NPR radio show with a woman, with a talk show host, and with the poor ombudsman of the city of Detroit. And for an hour, this poor ombudsman was being beaten up of how outrageous it was that Detroit was saying no to any entrepreneur who wanted to get started in Detroit. And of course, at the end, he just says, "Oh, lady, just go ahead and start your food truck. We'll never catch you." Right? That's the that's the Detroit answer. But there's a reason why Detroit has those barriers to entrepreneurship. The restaurant owners in Detroit don't want the competition. It's the insiders blocking the outsiders. And this is what happens over and over again in the places that have older industries. We'll see this in lots of different ways. But this is one example of the way that insiders block outsiders, which is the fearsome rise of occupational licensing in the US, often for occupations where it's hard to understand why in the world you would need a license for this. Like, for example, optician. Now, opticians in the modern world, what do? They take your prescription, someone else, an actual doctor has done this prescription, and then they tell you, do you want round frames or square frames, right? And then they type in your prescription, and then they send it in the order, right? So clearly you need licensing for that because, goodness knows without a license they might recommend square frames when you clearly needed round frames, and that would be a clear public interest. Or, goodness knows they might type in the wrong size of the glasses, right? That might be a terrible thing. But, you can see the areas in the US that have licensing, and again, it matches up with this Eastern Heartland. You don't see this happening in the Dakotas, you see this happening in the Carolinas. I think it's useful when thinking about the Eastern Heartland to try and understand one state a little better. And the original title for this topic, which Larry vetoed, but Howard liked it a lot, was What's the Matter with Kentucky, right? So I don't know if he just doesn't like Tom Frank or he doesn't like William Allen White. I'm not sure what the story is, but is that, yeah. But Kentucky is third in terms of the growth of prime male joblessness over the last 30 years. So it's behind Louisiana, it's behind Mississippi, and then comes Kentucky for the rise of prime male joblessness. But Kentucky is actually much more interesting than Mississippi or West Virginia because there are parts of Kentucky that are really doing fine. And that's what's interesting about Kentucky is the mixture of it. It's not that Kentucky is doing everything wrong. It's that the good coexists with the bad. This is another way of seeing Kentucky's exceptionalism. Here we have share of the population using, with non-medical use of pain relievers in 2002, and the drug poisoning fatalities per 100,000 in 2011, 2013. As you can see in that year, West Virginia was tops in the nation on opioid deaths, but Kentucky is, running in their rear. Now, Louisville is a city that has plenty of attractive things. But it also has a hangover of its industrial past, right? So Louisville is a city, like all of America's older cities, that formed because of waterways. It's there because of the falls of the Ohio, of course. And after the Civil War, it grew dramatically as a distribution point, as a place for industry, as one of the great industrial centers of the New South, of the post-war South. It benefited from geography, and that geography still helps it today. Its central location is why UPS is there, and UPS is a massive distribution hub there. But it's older, and in 1947, when the Taft-Hartley Act was passed, and most of the southern states all signed up immediately to be right-to-work states because they didn't have industrial labor unions, because they didn't have established insiders who could fight against the outsiders. Kentucky did. Kentucky had labor unions in the coal mines, Kentucky had labor unions in Louisville, and they said no. And until this year, Kentucky was not a right-to-work state, right? And consequently, this huge bump that all of the states that had right-to-work laws had, and the work of Tom Holmes at the University of Minnesota showed us about 20 years ago, the tremendous difference in industrial growth in those counties that had right-to-work laws with those counties that didn't when they're just over the state boundary, really a huge difference in industrial growth. Kentucky didn't benefit from that. Kentucky had rules that weren't amenable towards moving down industry. Now, you see the Kentucky good and bad very clearly in the rise of the automobile industry there. So Kentucky has attracted Toyota famously in the 1990s. Toyota set up their plant. And they've had Ford facilities in Louisville and a GM facility in Bowling Green for quite some time. This is a difficult balance for Kentucky. So Kentucky actually has quite high labor costs relative to other southern states and high labor costs in the field of auto manufacturing, but they have a governor, and they've had governors who were pro-business for a long time. So it's an interesting balance between having relatively pro-government leadership, relative pro-business leadership at the top, and having rules that still made it difficult for companies to come down. Kentucky's leaders have cared a lot about education also for many decades. And they've had modest success. These are ACT test scores. They're given to 100% of Kentucky's high school graduates. They show very modest increases, okay, very modest increases over time. People have won awards in Kentucky. So the Kennedy School's Innovations Program awarded Kentucky with an award in the late 1990s for their work on education. They've cared about it. They've tried to make changes. But it has been a very slow slog. It's been very hard. Now, one of the reasons that it's been such a slow slog is that there is not one Kentucky, but two. Kentucky, like the Heartland, is split between an east and a west. Between a western part of Kentucky that is really trying, that has business groups in Louisville that are trying to revitalize the downtown, that has governors that are fighting for better education, that has a university system that is at least trying to do its best. And it has this great swath of eastern and southern Kentucky that still remains one of the poorest parts of the nation. And it is a part of the nation that is losing ground rather than gaining it. The big dots show income, so again, huge income differences, and the light dot shows education, right? The dark areas are ones in which 25, 30% of adults have college degrees. The light ones are less than 1 in 10, right? Huge gap in terms of skills across space. And it's very, very hard to even imagine how you would meaningfully reform these areas in Appalachia where less than 1 in 10 adults have a college degree. This is perhaps an even more depressing line. This is mortality, okay? So in the series of counties that you have there in dark red, life expectancy is 70 years. The dark green one's life expectancy is 78 or 79 years. A 10-year life expectancy gap within a single state in the US. 2 Kentuckys. Now, in some sense, the right way to view Kentucky is its old problems colliding with new technologies. So Kentucky has been poor. Parts of Kentucky have been poor for a very long time. This guy, I just love this guy. This guy is, coal mining 70 years ago. This is a famous picture of a baptism in rural Kentucky from 1940. This was the place that LBJ decided to declare his war on poverty in Martin County, Kentucky. This is a place that's practically a byword for American poverty for generations. And, but that's gotten worse in many ways. That problem has gotten more significant because new technologies have collided with old poverty, with old lacks of skills. So coal mining, right, is the traditional industry here, right? Mining, moonshining, and moving down the road, as they put it in Coal Miner's Daughter. But coal mining has, like all industries, collided with new technologies. So the green line shows output from Kentucky mining. The red line shows employment in Kentucky mines. Output is more or less constant. Employment has plummeted by more than 60%, right? So whereas in the start of this graph, in 1979, mining was a perfectly labor-intensive occupation, lots of jobs for less skilled people. Flash forward to the aughts, right? It's a very capital-intensive industry. There aren't jobs for less skilled workers in the same way. That is, in some sense, the US economy in a microcosm, right? That these new technologies have meant that people with very few skills need to find a new way. And that way was not going to be found in eastern Kentucky. New technology number 2. This is not just opioids. These are generic opioids, okay? These are technology in the form of pain killing, which has descended like a curse on the high poverty areas of America. This is partially about the pain of their lives. This is partially about physical pain that they experience. And it's partially about the fact that we often make it free for them to get started taking this drug, right, through various government programs. Right? Again, new technologies, when they collide with old problems, can often make things worse. The welfare state has also been part of our attempted solution, but it also has been part of the problem by subsidizing disability. So this is the federal government expenditures per capita across state, and as you can see, Kentucky is over $12,000 in terms of per capita federal expenditures, right? So a huge recipient. This is, which comes from Pew, is the share of each state's GDP that comes from federal government engagement. So in Kentucky, it's in this 30 to 40% range. That federal contribution. So it's a state that receives a massive amount of federal aid. And that is not a path towards economic reinvention. One of the biggest things that federal aid did, and remember, we had a strategy towards Appalachia in the 60s, and it was a very heavy infrastructure-related strategy. We built these highways, which were meant to connect these far-flung parts of Appalachia. Right? My own work from about 10 years ago shows that they did have an effect in the 1970s that was positive, of being in the Appalachian Regional Commission. We're comparing counties that just made it versus counties that didn't. Over the long run, the effect appears to be slightly negative. That the ARC, the Appalachian Regional Commission, this access to federal bounty didn't do anything positive. That in the longer run, it did something negative. Now, what can we do about this? What's the right answer for these things? So there are a number of solutions that circulate. First thing I'm going to do is just make fun of one, okay? So one of the most popular ones in certain crowds are things like the Guggenheim Bilbao. Right? So it's lovely. Gary did a beautiful job, I guess, on the architecture. And it's often triumphed as exactly what you should do to cause a declining industrial city to come back. Now, you can just go on Eurostat's website right now, and you will find that Bilbao's unemployment rate is 19%. Okay? So this may be a fantastic strategy for creating a nice picture on Google Images, right? It's not a great strategy for any kind of employment for less skilled workers, right? This is foolish. But at least this one's a pretty good museum. The Sheffield's National Center for Popular Music in troubled Sheffield opens in 1999 and closes in 2000. So this one's even worse. But it looks good with the rainbow underneath there. Another strategy that it seems like every city in America, no matter how utterly implausible it will be that they will become the Amazon headquarters, seems dedicated towards being the next Amazon headquarters. So I am sure that there are Appalachian towns that are dreaming of attracting Amazon right now. So first of all, if you do stand a chance of getting Amazon, you actually don't really need the help. Right? There's no way that Amazon is going to be attracted to a place that does not have very abundant human capital and relatively pro-business governments. So if you've got that infrastructure, all right, you're going to stand a chance with Amazon, but you don't need it. And in the long run, right, regional revitalization comes from homegrown entrepreneurship far more than large employers. One of the curses of mining regions is that mines were big industries. They tended to speak well with other large firms. And this deterred small firms from getting started. My own work with Bill Kerr finds that in places that had coal mines and steel mines 100 years ago, they had larger firms, even in totally unrelated industries, even in finance and accounting 50 years later. Less entrepreneurship over the next 50 years, less economic growth. Right? The last thing you want to be doing is really focusing on smokestack chasing or large employer chasing. Right? And whenever you think about trying to attract an employer, you want to be thinking about the skills that that employer is going to be creating. Don't ask yourself how many jobs are going to be created today. Ask yourself how many new firms are going to be spun off from this employer 10 years hence. Right? That's the question. Is it going to be developing human capital in some long-run sense? And there are poorer parts of America in which having a factory come in can be a big burst. There are places that start with very low skill levels. But you need to be thinking at least of areas in which you have some potential spillover for the local communities. I think when we think about revitalizing areas, we want to put entrepreneurship first. And I want to highlight a few things, which I would recommend for declining parts of more successful cities as well. Entrepreneurship zones, areas that understand the importance of getting the rules right. This is as important in Detroit as it is in Appalachia, right? So one-stop permitting for new businesses, right? Make sure you focus that power in one agent where you can tell whether or not they're permitting slowly or permitting quickly. Make it easy for a person to get started. It is a crime in this country that we make it so much harder for poorer people to start businesses than for richer people to start businesses, right? It is easy if you want to start a startup around Kendall Square to get started with your internet company. It is really hard if you want to start a bodega that sells milk products, right? It's a lot of a harder permitting hurdle to get through. That is a crime. We need to make it as easy for all types of people to permit. Secondly, reasonable pro-business policies. Rethink the tax policies, rethink right-to-work policies. Both Michigan and Kentucky have moved towards being right-to-work states in recent months. It's hard not to see that there's some hope in that. So this is one set of the equation. And again, this is about getting the rules right. It's not about subsidies. It's not about bribing businesses to open in the area. It's about making sure that anyone with a good idea can get started, because every unemployed American is a failure of entrepreneurial imagination. Second, replace the earned income tax credit and a large bevy of our social insurance programs with a targeted work subsidy, something that effectively pays workers on a per-hour basis a bit more to go to the job. This will cost something, but in fact, we can take it out of Medicaid. We can take it out of Medicare. We can stop bribing Americans not to work. We can stop imposing the huge penalties on working that disability insurance does with policies that actually encourage Americans to work. It should be mobile, right? It should enable you to work anywhere, but we need to actually direct these resources in a way that puts people back to work. Finally, on this page, eliminate the unnecessary occupational licensing. But just to prove that I'm not a complete libertarian and to get John Tierney mad at me, right, I am absolutely fine with regulating the heck out of opioids. Okay, so there are things that we do to our bodies that are such that you do actually want to regulate them. But opticians, let her rip. Okay. Okay. On basic education, continue the slow and basic process. Right. Competitively source vocational training. There's no reason why big schools should be the right place to train people to do computer work in the 21st century. You need nimble providers, right? You need the private sector engaged. You need startups engaged. You need even unions engaged. Outsource it. Do it on weekends. Do it on the summer. Make sure people aren't segregated off in complete vocational training tracks. And then evaluate. Constantly engage in randomized controlled trials to know whether or not these providers are any good. And the beauty of training someone to be a plumber, not only will they earn a decent wage, but you actually know if the training programs worked immediately when the person graduates. You don't have to wait 10 years to see the IRS records. You can actually evaluate it right then and there. Experiment with entrepreneurship training. The Possible Project, which I work with in Cambridge, is one project which is trying to actually see whether or not you can teach kids to be entrepreneurs. I don't even know if this will work in the long run, but teaching kids to sell things on eBay and then to come up with their own products may be the best way to teach them math or teach them responsibility as well. And finally, right, moral education. And this is a very hard thing for an economist to talk about because we're not known as the dismal science for nothing. But the more that I have lived, the more that we face this problem, the more that we see both opioids, the decline in marriage rates, the rise in single-parent families in the American heartland. This is at least as important as any skills around plumbing that you could have. And I know you certainly can't legislate that, right? And the last thing in the world I would be recommending is that somehow or other the government should be doing that. But this has to be, if these regions are ever going to come back, they need a moral revival, at least as much as they need an economic one. Finally, infrastructure. So I have spoken here, and I will continue to reiterate, that new roads won't fix Appalachia. Okay? New roads are rarely the right fix for something. But we can have new roads. And there is a good model of new roads, which is privately funded, privately provided, financed by user fees. This is particularly natural in the world of autonomous vehicles. Right? Having autonomous vehicles going on dedicated lanes at 100 miles an hour is a great substitute for a high-speed rail line between lots of low-density parts of America. So what we should be experimenting with is ways to get more mileage into the road system that is privately funded and ultimately paid for by user fees. Remember, if autonomous vehicles don't pay for the congestion that they create, they have every capacity to make New York City congestion worse, not better. And indeed, unless we get in the principle that autonomous cars pay for the cost of the congestion that they create, we're going to screw this one up completely. But will any of this fix Appalachia? I don't know. Okay? This is a really hard one. In some cases, the right answer is just to leave. This is a map of the share of Americans by state, and this comes from Gallup, where they're saying the share of people who would like to move to a different state. Notice Illinois seems to be particularly high up on that list. Kentucky is not out of reach. I think we do want to get the rules right in different places. Right? We do want to give Kentucky its best shot. We want to give Appalachia its best shot. But the federal government does not have a reason to induce people to live in the foothills of the Rockies. It does not have a reason to induce people to live in the foothills of the Appalachian Mountains either. Right? The right job of the federal government is to do its best to enable businesses to flourish, enable people to move. And indeed, the right answer for many Appalachians is to get out, right? And to find a brighter future somewhere else. And this is even more true in our post-manufacturing era. For most low-skilled Americans, services are the answer. Right? The service economy is very much the future. Now, that's hard for guys because in lots of services we have to be nice to people, and most of us middle-aged men have a comparative disadvantage at that, okay? But I believe actually we can learn to be nice. We just have to listen to our wives more often. But services are the future, but they're not going to be services in Appalachia. They're going to be services in the coast. And that, of course, as in any Manhattan Institute event, we have to come back to NYCHA. Right? Because NYCHA is ultimately the great source of all misery in the world. But there's a very nice new Howard piece on NYCHA, actually. But I want to put this in a broader context, which is that throughout most of American history, you have had a continual dance of regions. People leave Massachusetts, right? A declining region. They move west. They move to a place where there is opportunity. That has been the way that this country has always worked. This is what Frederick Jackson Turner's frontier hypothesis was all about. But in the 20th century, we moved to cities as well. Right? We found new futures in the Sun Belt. We found new futures in different places. That dance is intrinsic to America. We are not people who stay in the same French village that our families have lived in for 800 years, right? We are not people who live in the same contrada in Siena that our family has lived in for 3,000 years. We're people who move constantly, right? One of my ancestors who came to New York in the late 19th century came from Kentucky, okay? This is not something that is in any sense impossible. And yet, over the past 30 years, because of the revolution in property rights that has occurred in this country, we have made it increasingly difficult to move into the most productive parts of America. 50 years ago, right, whether in New York City or in California, developers had a relatively free hand. The result of this was that we mass-produced housing in coastal California on a vast scale and made it possible for people to afford living in Los Angeles, to live in greater San Francisco. Today, Greater San Francisco has areas with 60-acre minimum lot sizes, and we all know how difficult it is to permit in New York City, right? That is saying no to everyone who wants to leave Appalachia to find a brighter future. Every time a suburban community in Connecticut or New Jersey or Massachusetts or California says no to new building, they're basically saying stay there in rural poverty, stay there in Appalachia. The safety valve is still the western hinterland. The safety valve is still Texas, right? And it still exists and it still offers opportunity. But you saw that divergence in skills between the western hinterland and the coast, right? That may continue. The advantage that places like Texas that love business have in the rules department may make up for weaknesses in the schools department. But still, right, it is incumbent upon this city, it is incumbent upon the Manhattan Institute to work to make New York a more welcoming place for talent, to make sure that it is not just about welcoming talent from other countries to come here and find a better future, but to welcome Americans who are troubled, and to remember that this is not a country where the coast is somehow or other separated from the hinterland. We are all part of one country. We all need each other. We all determine each other's futures. And the best thing that New York can do is to actually welcome. That's its place in things, and to provide the opportunity that this great city has provided for so long. So I don't actually want to end on any sort of a down note, right? This is a huge challenge that we face. The eastern heartland of America is in deep trouble. It is not just in deep economic trouble, it is in deep moral trouble, right? But we have solutions. We have solutions that involve freedom, we have solutions that involve skills, and we have solutions that involve migration. Let's work on all of those solutions and let's make it work. Thank you for your time. Sure. Okay, sure.
Like New York City and like San Francisco, where there are a lot of PhDs and BAs, where we have a mayor, de Blasio, who apparently thinks the government should run every square foot of housing. But just a comment there, but my question specifically is, I'm intrigued by your idea about earned income tax credit being a problem. Could you elaborate on why it is, and then also talk about what you...
Let me take the second question first. So first of all, the earned income tax credit is actually was a great policy reform, and I don't think it's a problem. I think it can be made better. It is exactly the right design, which is to make work pay more, not less, from government programs. The problem with the EITC is that it's extremely confusing and it's not powerful enough. Okay, so what I think we need for the 21st century is a ramped up EITC that's simpler, that's tied more directly just to the straight number of hours that you worked. So that's the point of the EITC. I think disability is a huge problem the way that we currently have structured, but I don't think that the EITC is a huge problem. I just think it can be made better, and it certainly was a huge step forward in its time. Now, schooling. Now, first of all, in terms of political common sense, I think everyone knows the relationship between political knowledge and education is, an inverted U. I think we know that, and it certainly, after a certain amount of time, folly overtakes wisdom in terms of the effects of education, and that's certainly right. So, I mean, education has its values on this, and the way, at least I think about it, is that education at its basic level is about empowering people to figure out how to make changes and to work together. And it's an enormously valuable tool, again, but it peaks after a certain level, right? So, okay, further questions? Yes, sir.
I have 2 questions.
Yes, sir.
Thank you. First is about Michigan. In today's Wall Street Journal, there was a editorial from the editorial board, and maybe Mr. McGurn could weigh in about Michigan and how well it was doing and some of the things that have happened there. And I would be curious to hear your views. The second is about something you touched on at the end of your presentation. It's about the sociological issues, which I think Charles Murray captured perfectly in his book, Coming Apart. And to me, I think this is almost an intractable issue in terms of moving us forward. And I would be curious about whether you have any ideas about how this reverses, because it seems to be an extraordinarily difficult hurdle.
I agree with the latter. Michigan, I liked the Wall Street Journal editorial. Michigan is a state that has suffered from huge insider bias, right? So it's sort of the touchstone of the early super successful industrial state that then erected rules that made it very, very hard for new businesses to form. On top of the fact that Detroit had one core industry that was dominated by a few firms, right? And this sucked out all of the energy out of the greater industrial ecosystem. I mean, if you go back to the 1890s, there's a good argument that Detroit was the most entrepreneurial place on the planet, right? It's not just about Henry Ford, right? It's about the Dodge brothers, the Fisher brothers, David Dunbar, Buick, Ransom E. Olds, Billy Durant, and nearby Flint, right? A cluster of genius, each person, right? Stealing each other's ideas, looking to each other for parts and financing, doing something magical. And Ford wins, and he creates this vast vertically integrated factory in the River Rouge. And in the short run, it's a great recipe for productivity, right? $5 days for ordinary workers, mass mobility for far-flung farmers, right? Helping to power the American war effort during World War II. In the long run, this kind of small number of firms, oligopoly, the seesaw back and forth with the UAW, right? This is as anti-competitive as you could possibly want. And it ended up being deeply harmful for the long-run prospects of Detroit and of Michigan. The way I think to see Detroit and the way to see Michigan is that it's an area where, it's suffered long, and eventually the political steamroller just pushed back. And there's trying to make change to open up Michigan to more competition. The moral dimension is much harder. And again, I have less standing to talk about this, right? I mean, it's an issue for private entrepreneurs of ethics to come forth. But there's no question that there's an ethical sickness in many of these areas. So there's a place in Pennsylvania, it's not that far outside of Scranton, where my wife's family is from, and her grandfather went into a coal mine at age 11. Died at age 59, which wasn't terrible in terms of life expectancy. Wasn't a bad life for him. I mean, he put 2 girls through college. He worked hard. He prayed. He was as decent a guy as you could possibly expect to find. You see there today, right? I had a 2-hour Uber drive with a grandma who was there taking me to Newark Airport afterwards. The first thing you learn is that it's a great time for Uber in this part of the world because so many guys have lost their licenses because of DWIs. Right? So you take people to work on this. The second thing is the big local news is her neighbor's meth lab got blown up by some explosives that he was playing with. So you then learn that explosives and meth labs don't mix, okay, which you may not have known without that. And you just feel that this is the land that everything has forgotten, that nobody's married, nobody sees a future in decency on this. So it's just very, very hard. Now, we have had in this country great awakenings from time to time. We have had spiritual revivals at various points in time. We've typically had them through religious agents, but there have sometimes been non-religious agents who have also powered that. I guess I'm hoping for that. But I'm an economist. I don't know how to do it other than talking about the fact that I'm sure that it matters, and it matters in a really big way. Yes, sir. And you next. Okay. And her next.
On a related theme, the author of White Working Class, Joan Williams, puts forth the idea that the urgings from coastal elites to relocate, to get higher education, for men to work get jobs in service industries is a gesture of disregard or even contempt towards the heartland, the beleaguered heartland population. I'm wondering from you if in fact they don't do those things, are they doomed to being a permanent underclass, or are there other forms of adaptation that they can pursue to get out of a decades-long decline?
So I think that the view that coastal elites lecturing people is usually counterproductive is right. So I think I mean, I can say as an economist that the track record of unskilled places is pretty dismal, and the track record of unskilled people is pretty mixed. But I wouldn't find myself going into Appalachia and lecturing them on going to school. And I think, you know, the most important thing if you're actually having this conversation has to start with respect for the people there. Right? They're not, you know, I mean, I was in Japan for 2 weeks, and I was struck by the sense of respect that's even given to lower skilled service workers there. Now, it's not they're clearly bowing more, so I mean, there's clearly a hierarchy, but everyone has their place in the system, everyone is respected, and I think it really has to start with that, and it can't come as a coastal state lecture on that. That being said, you need to have ways of speaking about it that don't seem disrespectful. Right? So you have to see ways that are empowering and that don't make it seem as if you want to turn them into, you know, some version of yourself, which, you know, I'm well aware of my own failings, that that's hardly the right model for anybody. So the right goal here is to figure out some way of speaking to people that, you know, actually works. And again, you know, business leaders can help in this in a way that's better than academics. If there was more, you know, if there were more religious leaders who spoke up on this, that would also be quite helpful. Right, so people who actually have a way of know how to speak to people in the heartland, that would be great. But I know the right answer isn't for people on the coast who care about these regions to stop paying attention to it. Right, I know that that's not the right answer either, even if we're not going to persuade people in the heartlands ourselves. But it does have to start with respect, and it does have to start with, you know, there's often a lot more courage in getting through life there than it is through getting through our lives. Yes.
Thank you. You mentioned the problem of licensing, for example, the optician. I think isn't the reason that many states want to raise revenues that way? I wonder if it's realistic to think that they would roll back some of those requirements. Also, just a question about the role of the federal government as well as the role of corporations in addressing these problems. I'd be interested in your thoughts.
So first of all, I don't do realism, remember. That's not, you know, the point of an academic is to actually say things that aren't realistic, right? Remember, when Milton Friedman was talking, okay, about having voucher schools 60 years ago, nothing could have been less realistic. Now it's a reality, right? So part of our job is to say things that won't get us elected, and I'm certainly not counting on any state that has occupational licensing to turn it around because I said so. But unless we start talking about it, it's not going to change. So that's I think part of the part of our job description almost. The role of the federal government in this is somewhat mixed. So I've long had the view that whatever redistribution we think should happen in this country has to be done at the federal level rather than at the local level. Right? We know this. Any kid who grew up in New York City in the 1970s knows this. That when you try to run a local welfare state, the businesses just leave. The rich people just leave. Whatever you think needs to be done to redress social inequalities, it really should come from the top. And I think that's the right job for Washington, and to do so hopefully in a way that does not deter work, that does not end up creating more misery than it eliminates, right? So I think basically on the righting the wrongs of the world, fighting social inequalities, however much you think should be done about it, it should be done from the top, not from the bottom. Maybe administered from the bottom, maybe there should be more local experimentation. In terms of businesses, well, every local economy depends upon its businesses. In terms of entrepreneurship is ultimately where this stuff comes from. I think there's a special role for business leaders in that a lot of them actually know how to speak to Middle America in ways that academics don't, in ways that many politicians don't. And I would hope that, you know, more business leaders would talk about what they see as being the right way towards an honorable future for people living in these areas. Yeah.
Is there a state in the eastern heartland that is making some headway, that is moving in some of the directions that you have described? And is it government leadership? Is it business leadership? Is there a state, or are they all just a lost cause at the moment?
So let's focus on the sub-state level, if you could. So I think there's been progress in Louisville, right? I think certainly there's been progress in Columbus, Ohio, right? These are places in which there's a combination between business and government, and the businesses are not just about protecting their insider benefits, usually because they're export industries, right? What, you know, the exporters of, you know, UPS is not looking for goodies from Louisville. They're looking to make their global operation function better, right? Same thing could be true about the businesses that are part of the Columbus Partnership in Ohio, right? So getting businesses involved in trying to up the quality of local government has often worked, and those are examples that I would look at. Now, in terms of states, in some sense, this line was drawn to get the states that were doing better outside of it. So Minnesota, Wisconsin, states that have made a fair amount of progress and look reasonably healthy along lots of dimensions. In Minnesota, the secret sauce is, of course, education, right? And again, it's not about guys with PhDs at the University of Minnesota, although there are some, right? Guys who are in medical technology have made a big difference for the Minnesota economy. But it's also about just ordinary people in Minnesota being better educated and being more functional in a 21st century economy. So, and when I look across America, the places that I think of as being the most dynamic are the skilled Sun Belt superstar cities. The Austins, right? The Raleighs, the places, even the Atlantas, right? It kills Bostonians that Atlanta is about as educated as Boston is. As a city, right? But it's true, right? And that's a big change. And this combination of both, hanging out a shingle and being open for business and making it easy for firms to get started, making it easy to mass produce housing, right? So you actually can buy someplace affordable. That combination with actually knowing that education is not something to be feared, that education is actually crucial, that's an incredibly powerful combination. And that's where America really hums. And I think that's what we're hoping for, is that the places in the South that know that they're pro-business but aren't pro-education become more pro-education, and the places in the North that know that they're pro-education but think that business is evil become more pro-business, right? And sort of meeting in that middle is I think the ultimate goal on this. One more question. Yes, ma'am.
You mentioned that low-skilled employees of manufacturing need to transition to the service sector. Is there a degree at which do we need a minimal manufacturing sector, I guess is what I'm asking. Does an economy have to have manufacturing in order to be complete?
I don't think there's a problem with American manufacturing. I don't think it's going to go away. The problem is it's become much more automated, right? I mean, when Henry Ford had his plants 100 years ago, the average amount of square footage per worker was about 200 square feet. Today, that number is over 2,000 square feet per worker because the work is done by the machines. Go back to look at this stuff, right? For coal. It's not that the coal production disappeared over this time period. It's declined since then. It's that the employment declined. So I don't think that manufacturing is going to go away in this country. I just think it's going to be done increasingly particularly for ordinary products that can be mass produced. It's being done with machines, not by less skilled workers. So I see a future in which a robust manufacturing sector for the U.S., but just not one in which millions of less skilled American workers get to work on factory floors. The ones that are there are going to be increasingly people who know how to deal with robots and know how to deal with the technology that they put in. So I'm certainly not in any sense anti-manufacturing. Most of this manufacturing, you just know that immediately from the 2,000 square feet per worker. It's not going to be urban, right? Any industry that requires 2,000 square feet per worker is not one that you're going to put in a high land value city. But it is a robust part of America, and it can even be helpful in certain types of urban reinvention. But it's hard not to think that or regional reinvention, that the larger issue is one of taking advantage of the service economy, like that grandmother who was driving Uber in northeastern Pennsylvania, and finding a future for there. And that's just a thing which, I meant what I said. I understand that I'm on dangerous ground talking about differences between men and women. But if I just look at my wife and I look at myself, she's much better at being nice to people than I am. Right, and that's true, endemically in lots of areas in which I look around. And services put a very high premium on actually behaving nicely to people and not behaving like the wonderful grandparents in Hillbilly Elegy, right? Who had lots of good things about them, but you put them in a service job, somebody would have gotten killed out of this, right? So those skills need to be somehow or other need to be made. And it's worthwhile emphasizing that when I talk about skills. Right? One of the reasons why I'm emphasizing this wage subsidy, I talked about this in the last Wilson lecture, right? Most skills for these men are going to be learned on the job. They're not going to be skills that are actually going to be taught in a university or even some kind of vocational training program. The key is getting them to work in some kind of service industry where someone will yell at them and fire them if they don't actually start behaving properly towards other people and showing up. And that's the first step, is getting them back to work and getting them in a purpose in which they can rebuild that human capital around skills that are valuable in the 21st century.
All right, with that, that'll have to be our last question. Everybody, thank you. Thank you, Ed.
Thank you, Aaron. Pleasure. Yeah.